Well, here we are. It's Monday, September 26th, 2022. My name is Larissa, and today I'm going to begin reading Josef Pieper, Abusive Language, Abusive Power. And before I do that, somebody claiming to be Russell Brand is using this number 1-318-215-6951. And this person, I've texted with them, and it's very interesting because, like, I asked questions, didn't answer any of my questions. The replies seem very canned. It's like, I think it's some sort of like scam bot kind of thing. And then they're asking to do a trade so that you don't have to depend on the government. I don't exactly know what that means, and they won't answer it. So, Mr. Russell Brand, I will be hashtagging you in this, and just, you want to check out and find out who's pretending to be you at this number, 318-215-6951. And also, before I go any further, congratulations to Italy on their election. And I don't know anything about the person that you have elected. But whenever democratic process is upheld and occurs, that's great. To me, being a mother, having pushed a child out of your body, or otherwise raising a child, is not a credential to be touted. Men don't put that on their resumes. Having children, that's not a resume point, and it is sexist to use it as a resume point on a woman's resume. So that does not impress me, nor does touting your religion, though I am a Christian, and I would not say that I would vote for somebody just because they're Christian or just because they're a woman, and certainly not because they're a mother. Women have been having babies since the beginning of time, right? Women, the time of women. Women have been having babies. There's nothing special about that gives you any kind of special powers or qualifications, right? So those things do not impress me, and neither do looks. So as long as you're serving your constituency, congratulations to you. Have fun. Congratulations on being the first woman elected in Italy. That's really, really cool, but none of the other stuff I've heard about you impresses me at all. So, that being said, let's read this. Start reading this Josef Pieper, Abusive Language, Abusive Power. Abusive Language, Abusive Power. Translated by Lothar Krauth, Ignatius Press. Contents: abusive language, abusive power, knowledge and freedom. Abusive language, abusive power. The topic of this essay can also be stated as the abuse of language in its relation to the abuse of power. I intend to approach the subject from two different directions. Though these are two distinct considerations, I shall nonetheless try to show their intrinsic connection. One of these considerations is a phenomenon of classic antiquity, Plato's lifelong battle with the sophists, those highly paid and popularly applauded experts in the art of twisting words, who were able to sweet-talk something bad into something good and turn white into black. They are those people whom Plato, in his dialogues, puts in confrontation with Socrates. To be sure, historically, don't worry, it is not my concern in this. It is rather Plato's position, and this indeed is the other consideration, which shall be taken as a paradigm showing, I believe, something directly relevant for us and our own situation today. The case can be made that Plato recognized, identified, and battled in the sophistry of his time a danger and a threat besetting the pursuits of the human mind and the life of society in any era. Anything in what follows that may at first appear to be perhaps a mere historical description and interpretation should therefore, in point of fact, be taken as a commentary on the present. And further, then, anything that may at first sound like a mere critique of the present, aimed at our own situation, should also be taken as a pointing to a timeless temptation that since the beginning of history has always required mankind's resistance and will require it forever. This timeless character of the sophist phenomenon, transcending any particular age, prompted certain important, indeed disturbing comments by Hegel. True, he called the sophists of Socrates' time extremely refined and learned people. But such praise in Hegel's manner of speaking sounds somewhat ambiguous. It is precisely such learned refinement, says Hegel, such absolute and unmoored questioning, that plucks apart any object and dialectically discredits everything. It is such refined reasoning as expression repeatedly used by Hegel that poses the true danger. It almost inevitably leads us, says Hegel, to the conviction that everything can be justified if we look hard enough for reasons. To quote Hegel, you need not have advanced very far in your learning in order to find good reasons even for the most evil of things. All the evil deeds in this world, since Adam and Eve, have been justified with good reasons. Hegel, therefore, sees a danger clearly intrinsic to the human mind, being part of its nature, a danger that can perhaps be overcome but never entirely avoided. And this danger could become all the more threatening, the more highly man's power of judgment, that is, his mental formation, is perfected. Granted, what the accepted monographs say about the sophists may indeed be correct. Werner Jaeger, for one, sees in the sophists the earliest humanists. They have been praised as great educators and teachers, as the first advocates for the freedom of thought, and so on. All this may well be entirely correct, and yet it is precisely here where the danger lurks. Only within the framework of those achievements can this specific destruction be wrought, a destruction that Hegel, too, has in mind when using the term sophistry. In this, the German philosopher is clearly siding with Plato. Both discuss something relevant beyond a specific era. Both identify a danger threatening the human mind and commonwealth at any time. But, of course, it is not only the sophist phenomenon itself that thus may assume an updated and contemporary interest and relevance, and as the human mind progresses in terms of ever greater sophistication, so also will the sophist phenomenon probably become ever more acute. The sophists are not as remote to us as we may imagine, says Hegel. I wish to make this statement the implicit motto of my reflections here, this, and Nietzsche's posthumous line, the era of the sophists, our time. To repeat then, it is not only the sophistic mentality itself that in this context arouses renewal interest, but also, and even more so, Plato's argumentation, his contention with the sophists. Why indeed was he so dead set against the sophists? In what did he see their evil influence? What exactly did he feel they threatened? What is it, in Plato's opinion, that must never be sacrificed under any circumstances if a man is to lead a truly human existence? Again, what did Plato have against the sophists? The outward appearance of these men, as depicted in Plato's dialogues, is sufficiently known. But there are rather obvious traits, and others not so obvious, and some may only seem to be obvious. To begin with, we notice the fact that these men are exceptionally successful, which every now and then prompts the sardonic admiration on the part of Socrates. He notes this merchandising of wisdom and disregard of the essential difference between money and the spirit, as if there were no difference between what used to be called artes liberales, the liberal arts, and what we now call mental work, as if there were no difference between honorarium and wages. This consideration is much more relevant than may appear at first. Bertrand Russell, in his History of Western Philosophy, observes rather contemptuously that those professors should get down from their high horse when they denounce the sophists because they accepted payments. The professors themselves take money, he says, and quite a lot of it. But this still does not capture the crucial point. The crucial point, the incommensurability, is not mentioned here. A casual remark by Socrates is much more on target. The Cratylus dialogue, which incidentally also discusses the problem of language, deals with a certain question that for us here is of no consequence, and Socrates remains silent. Finally, they ask him, "And what do you think, Socrates?" To which he replies, "I have no opinion on this, for I could afford only the 5 drachma lecture of Prodicus," one of those great sophists. "His 50 drachma lecture I could not afford, and I have been able to, then perchance I might be knowledgeable." That's so funny. Here the crucial point is made loud and clear. A few years ago, one of Einstein's friends published some recollections in the Frankfurt Allgemeine, in which he relates, among other things, what Einstein had once told him: "An American university has offered me $500,000 for the 12 original handwritten pages of my theory of relativity. This offer really bothers me. How can one sell the achievements of the mind?" And Sartre, in the presentation to the 1945 first issue of his magazine Le Temps Modernes, discusses the situation of the modern writer, indeed touching on many aspects, but also on our specific subject. He says, "Why in the world are we ashamed? Why do we blush when money is mentioned? We simply receive our wages as any other worker does. Well, yes, a sonnet consists of 14 lines. Will you be paid by the line or by the hour or by what standard? Maybe you need only 5 minutes for it, maybe 6 months. The crucial point here is that money and mind are incommensurable. This has to be kept in mind, it seems to me, if the subject matter is to be discussed from Plato's standpoint. Then there is this other aspect in the manner of the sophists. Are presented. Plato depicts them, without exception, as strangely handsome. And these adversaries of Socrates, who himself is ugly like Silenus. But this beauty, mentioned with an irony quite untypical for classical Greece, seems to point to something much more fundamental, much less obvious as well. The dialogue Protagoras begins with Socrates telling about the time when he returned from a party and met a friend who addressed him. "You look so excited, just as if you were coming from your handsome young friends Asyllabides." To which he replied, "Indeed, I am coming from a party where Asyllabides was also present, but I hardly paid attention to him. I did not even cast an eye on him, for you see, there was someone so much more handsome, Protagoras, the old sophist." This, of course, is meant as pure irony. Why should the classical Greeks speak of physical beauty in an ironical tone? But worse is to come. Ugliness receives praise as resembling Socrates. There is this dialogue, Theatius, a late writing together with a visiting professor who lectures on mathematics in Athens. Socrates is standing in front of a stadium in which a group of young men are getting dressed. And Socrates asks this Theodorus, "Did you notice among your listeners and students someone who is especially talented?" To which the other replies, "Yes, just one, but he is not, as you might think, the most handsome. On the contrary, he is quite ugly. He resembles you, the same flat nose, the same protruding eyes." Then the lads come rushing out, and the one in question is called over by Theodorus, Thaddeus, the name providing the title for the entire dialogue. "Thaddeus, do come here, Socrates desires to speak to you." And so this dialogue begins, progressing toward deep abstraction and speculation and becoming ever more difficult until finally Socrates asks Theatius, "Now please, show me what face I have." For Theodorus claims your face is similar to mine. This is arranged in such a roundabout manner as to warrant the question, what is Plato's purpose in all this? True beauty, of course, is not the subject of this irony here. It seems to me that we should understand this passage in a way similar to our notion of perfection. Taken literally, perfection means completion, wholeness. But when we speak of perfectionism, we really mean something negative, annoying, even dangerous. And the question as to what makes such perfectionism dangerous, applied to our topic, becomes the question, what indeed did Plato have against the sophists? Well, I have a thought on that. Plato and his dialogues were between gay men, and the sophists were largely lesbians, I think that's what the problem was. His objection could tentatively be summed up in these brief terms: corruption of the word. You're corrupting the language. Still, the core of the matter is not yet identified with this. The specific threat for Plato comes from the sophist's way of cultivating the word, with exceptional awareness of linguistic nuances and utmost formal intelligence, from their way of pushing and perfecting the employment of verbal constructions to crafty limits thereby, and precisely in this corrupting the meaning and the dignity of the very same words. Word and language, in essence, do not constitute a specific or specialized area. They are not a particular discipline or field. No, word and language form the medium that sustains the common existence of the human spirit as such. The reality of the word in eminent ways makes existential interaction happen. And so, if the word becomes corrupted, human existence itself will not remain unaffected and untainted. What, however, does corrupting the word mean? This question can obviously be answered only after what constitutes the dignity and import of the word within the totality of human existence has been clarified. Human words and language accomplish a twofold purpose, as Plato, without doubt, would have answered in clear agreement with the entire tradition of Western thought. Since this accomplishment is twofold, we may already here suspect that the words degeneration and corruption can also be twofold. First, words convey reality. We speak in order to name and identify something that is real, to identify it for someone, of course, and this points to the second aspect in question, the interpersonal character of human speech. These two aspects of the word in all language, though distinct, are nevertheless not separated. The one does not exist without the other. At first, we may well presume that such and such is simply a factual reality, and that all we want is to understand this reality and, of course, describe it. But, right, describe it? To whom? The other person is already in the picture. What happens here is already communication. In the very attempt to know reality, there already is present the aim of communication, and again, we may well presume at first that we are relating only to this one person we are addressing at one time. Still, what do we talk about? Indeed, we can only talk about reality, nothing else. Of course, there is also the possibility of lying, of falsifying. It is one of my favorite questions in tests, posed many times and not always answered to my satisfaction. Can a lie be taken as communication? I tend to deny it. A lie is the opposite of communication. It means specifically to withhold the other's share and portion of reality, to prevent his participation in reality. And so, corruption of the relationship to reality and corruption of communication, these evidently are the two possible forms in which the corruption of the word manifests itself. Because of these two corruptions, precisely because of them, Socrates over and again chides the sophist rhetoric, that artistry with words. This is, in Plato's dialogues, the constantly repeated lament and accusation, and to realize their astonishingly modern relevance, all we have to do is sum them up. Reality, you think, should be of interest to you only insofar as you can impressively talk about it. And because you are not interested in reality, you are unable to converse. You can give fine speeches, but you simply cannot join in a conversation. You are incapable of dialogue. Here again, the one cannot be separated from the other. Any discourse detached from the norms of reality is at the same time mere monologue. What does it mean, after all, to be detached from the norms of reality? It means indifference regarding the truth. To be true means, indeed, to be determined in speech and thought by what is real, and I do not think it to be simply a suggestive literary touch, though Plato would not be above that, when in his dialogues he depicts the man who claims as his business the dealing with words, the formal cultivation of how best to employ words, as a nihilist. Gorgias. He is, of course, a historical figure. We do know some of the opening sentences of his writings, and the very first sentence states that nothing is. This Gorgias does not mean, by any means, intend to deny the existence of countless facts that lead to even more countless new reports and commentaries. What he does not intend to say is this: there is no such thing as being. endowed, as it were, with normative authority that the one who speaks would have to respect or would be able to respect. The orientation towards reality, truth itself, and this is what it amounts to, call in all honesty not be the decisive concern of those who aim at verbal artistry. To raise such a question already reveals total ignorance of the essential requirements in the art of composing words. A writer can be defined as someone whose second nature is the conviction that the content of his thoughts and writings does not matter in the least. This statement, a very dogmatic statement, is it not? Is a quotation. It does not come from a sophist of Plato's dialogues, but rather from an important contemporary German author. Gorgias could have said the same thing, as he in fact expressed a similar idea. What is decisive is not what you say, but how you say it, its composition, its expression, its form. On the surface he is right, of course. It is not the subject matter, but the creative form that constitutes the linguistic piece of art. Still, Plato's concern points towards something else, and he insists on it, and he challenges us with it, even challenging himself in his own profound sensitivity for linguistic form, the possibility that something could well be superbly crafted, that it could be perfectly worded, brilliantly formulated, strikingly written, performed, staged, or put on screen, and at the same time, in its entire thrust and essence, be false, and not only false, but outright bad, inferior, contemptible, shameful, destructive, wretched, and still marvelously put together. Plato does not say, if something is marvelously put together, then you should have your suspicions right away. No, he simply asks to be aware of the possibility of something's being superbly crafted and nevertheless sham and foul, unless, to quote Plato's Socrates, we define the linguistic artist as a speaker of truth. The very moment such a notion is spelled out, we are part of a controversy. Controversy would even be a very mild term for the ensuing reaction, not different from Plato's times. Still, Socrates does not really trust the words of his conversation partner, Gorgias. He does not believe that verbal expressions unconcerned about any truth aim at nothing but pure form, daring images, superb style, and the achievement of new means of expression. The illusion, however, that this is the case, that exclusively or at least primarily this really happens, such a deceptive illusion may well persist for some time, with the ivory tower of a modern literary business, maybe even for an extended span of time, but Socrates compels Gorgias himself to debunk this pretense. He forces Gorgias to admit that such sophisticated language, disconnected from the roots of truth, in fact pursues some ulterior motives that invariably turns into an instrument of power, something it has been by its very nature right from the start. And with this, we have identified the other aspect of the corruption of the word, the destruction of its nature as communication. This particular issue, however, is somewhat obscured by the rather stilted terminology we have to put up with in all translations of Plato, especially in this particular area, so that the authentic message of Plato's reflections is grasped only with difficulty. There we read the art of persuasion, of flattery, of flattering speech, and the art of flattery. Such talk, obviously, does not raise the proverbial eyebrows of anybody. Before I go on here, so the symposium includes all of these dialogues that are being mentioned. And I suppose I should read that next after this. We'll read the symposium. It was Hegel who declared that the task of philosophy is not at all to raise anybody's eyebrows, but my point here is to show the underlying, rather provocative modern relevance. The very moment, as I have stated, that someone in full awareness employs words yet explicitly disregards reality, he in fact ceases to communicate anything to the other. This the reader may more or less have accepted, but an instrument of power? This is not too strong and too overbearing an expression. It really implies that from one moment to the next, the human relationship between the speaker and the listener changes. I have to say, yes, indeed, this is precisely what happens. This really is going on. Whoever speaks to another person, not simply, we presume, in spontaneous conversation, but using well-considered words, and whoever in doing whoever in so doing is explicitly not committed to the truth. Whoever, in other words, is in this guided by something other than the truth. Such a person, from that moment on, no longer considers the other as partner, as equal. In fact, he no longer respects the other as a human person. From that moment on, to be precise, all conversation ceases, all dialogue and all communication come to an end. But what then is taking place? This very question is answered by Socrates with an old-fashioned term, flattery. What takes place could perchance be flattery. Now, doggone, to stay with the Socratic idiom, what does that flattery mean? We no longer use this term in such a context. It has lost its bite, yet the subject matter itself is as relevant as ever. What then is flattery? Flattery here does not mean saying what the other likes to hear, telling him something nice, something to tickle his vanity. And what is thus said is not necessarily a lie either. For example, I might meet a colleague and say to him, I have read your recent article and I am fascinated. It could well be that I have not read the article at all and am therefore anything but fascinated. This does not yet amount to flattery. Or else I might indeed have read the article and I am really fascinated, and what I said was flattery nevertheless. In what lies the distinction? What makes the difference? The decisive element is this. Having an ulterior motive, I address the other not simply to please him or to tell him something that is true. Rather, what I say to him is designed to get something from him. This underlying design makes the message a flattery, even in the popular meaning of the word. The other, whom I try to influence with what he likes to hear, ceases to be my partner. He is no longer a fellow subject. Rather, he has become, for me, an object to be manipulated, possibly to be dominated, to be handled and controlled. Thus, the situation is just about the opposite of what it appears to be. It appears, especially to the one so flattered, as if a special respect would be paid, while in fact this is precisely not the case. His dignity is ignored. I concentrate on his weakness and on those areas that may appeal to him, all in order to manipulate him, to use him for my purposes. And insofar as words are employed, they cease to communicate anything. Basically, what happens here is speech without a partner, since there is no true other. Such speech, in contradiction to the nature of language, intends not to communicate but to manipulate. The word is perverted and debased to become a catalyst, a drug as it were, and is as such administered. Instrument of power may still seem a somewhat strong term for this, still it does not seem so far-fetched any longer. The relevance of all this becomes evident as soon as we ask ourselves in what areas we might find such flattery nowadays. Immediately this counter-question arises: is there still any area of life at all free of it? Any corner where I am spared such flattery designed to manipulate me, to make me buy something, for instance? And yet the slogans of our advertisements may still be relatively harmless examples. Maybe. Maybe it is after all not so harmless that this form of communication has become commonplace and is accorded a common place in our daily life. All the more questionable may be the fact that an inside knowledge, the psychoanalytical knowledge of man, is unscrupulously employed in this business. We should also consider how these ubiquitous commercials, in turn, possess the power to influence human attitudes, as these commercials propagate a dream world primarily by glorifying human weakness. Not that we should see the devil in every corner. May we indeed deny any serious threat in a kind of flattery that emphasizes our obvious sophistication, acknowledges us as connoisseurs, as being with it and youthful and whatever else, just so we buy this brand of cigarettes or that aftershave or this specific whiskey. Still, it can hardly be denied that our language through all this indeed progressively loses its character as communication, as it more and more tries to influence while less and less saying anything. I have only to walk through any town or city and observe the billboards advertising cigarettes, all those slogans. You've come a long way, baby. Smooth character. Come to where the flavor is. Alive with pleasure. Have nothing at all to do with the advertised products as such. They are simply nonsensical, yet they are no simple nonsense, but rather an extremely calculated and highly financed nonsense. What should make us stop and think is the ease with which we buy all this, buy it in both meanings of the word. The most genuine territory of sophistic flattery, however, is marked by a somewhat different approach, and concise terms to define it are difficult to find. Let me propose to analyze the concept of entertainment for just such a perspective. With this concept, I do not mean here the fun and games designed for having a good time together. I do not mean at all something that is actively done and arranged, but rather an area that is meant by the refreshingly frank, though somewhat crude expression, entertainment industry. I'm talking about those special consumer goods marketed by a peculiar production apparatus that has made flattery its big business. We should not think only of the trivialities found in certain popular magazines and hit shows. On the contrary, sophistic implies a claim to the highest standards of form and refinement. But the matter, we have to admit, is all in all rather complicated. They not only tickle your fancy here, as everywhere else, to induce you to buy their product, but also offer the flattery itself for sale and consumption. You are expected to pay for being flattered. And even this statement expresses the matter much too simply. The product for which I am ready to pay the price consists, strictly speaking, not only of the flattery that extols my own foibles. This, of course, is expected, but it should happen in such a manner that I remain unaware of what in truth is going on here. Of course, this is by definition one aspect of flattery. A flattery unmasked is all but contradiction in terms. The world wants to be deceived. The saying goes, mundus vult decipi. This is indeed true, yet at the same time too narrow. What the world really wants is flattery, and it does not matter how much of it is a lie. But the world at the same time also wants the right to disguise, so that the fact of being lied to can easily be ignored. As I enjoy being affirmed in my whims and praised for my foibles, I also expect credibility to make it easy for me to believe in good conscience, or at least without a bad conscience, that everything I hear, read, absorb, and watch is indeed true, important, worthwhile, and authentic. Such, then, is the demand. To such a demand, the supply has to respond if there is going to be a profitable business. Still, the demand is not concentrated only on what is commonly considered pleasing. There are not only sex, sensuality, vanity, nosiness, and sentimentalism. There are also cruelty and, indeed, Schadenfreude, the vicious enjoyment of others' misfortune. There are the obsessions with slander, the frenzy to destroy, and the readiness to accept radical answers, to go for the final solution. All these weaknesses need flattery. Yet not just any plain flattery. No, there has to be credibility. There have to be convincing reasons, in Hegel's words. To succeed in such a task is without doubt a demanding enterprise. Even Socrates loses all his irony in conceding this point to the sophists. You are truly experts in this. You must have a deep understanding of human nature. You know exactly which spot to hit. Such an endeavor, however, clearly carries with it the promise of boundless success. It can obviously thrive only within the medium of language, language taken in its most general meaning, speech, song, print, pictures, movies, and broadcast. The entire arsenal of the means of communication can potentially be employed. All these established, even institutionalized possibilities to process communication are by their very nature designed to function as vehicles of genuine human speech. They are designed, therefore, to capture and communicate reality. I believe it would be entirely unjust to contend that this fundamental character of the word, as a rule, is betrayed and corrupted. Still, it is quite evident that the danger of corruption increases as the promise of possible success becomes more tempting. Not just a specific sector is then endangered, such as the press or television or radio. No, the commonwealth The common will of all people is then threatened, since, by necessity, it functions through the medium of the word. Then we are faced, in short, with the threat that communication as such decays, that public discourse becomes detached from the notions of truth and reality. I said this danger is evident. It would be more correct, however, to say that it is evident that there can be such a threat. Unfortunately, the threat itself is not so readily recognized, for it is part of its nature to be concealed and disguised. It is therefore extremely difficult, at times impossible, to take a specific item such as a novel, a stage play, a movie, a radio commentary, or a critical essay, and identify the borderline that separates genuine communication rooted in reality from the mere manipulation of words aimed solely to impress. Formal excellence alone cannot be the decisive criterion. A philosophical discourse, or notably even a theological discourse, can equally be listed here, especially when it draws its power from the element of surprise, when thus it exploits the general intellectual ennui. Yes, even philosophy, theology, and the humanities, just like any fictional literature, however demanding and challenging, in essence may well be mere entertainment in our specific sense here. That is, a form of flattery, extremely refined perhaps, yet nevertheless courting favor to win success. And success in this does not necessarily mean huge sales and large profits. Any form of approval will do, either the applause of the masses or the admiration of the happy few. Plato stated it repeatedly. The difficulty in recognizing a sophist at all is part of his success. So writes John Wilde, the American scholar and expert on Plato. The sophist appears as a true philosopher, more so than the philosopher himself. How then can anyone be expected to tell which is which? Plato himself complicated this confusing picture even more. From the other end, as it were, it is not obvious, he wonders in his dialogue Phaedrus. Oh, Phaedrus is really good. That even those who have a genuine message of truth and reality must first court the favor of the people, so they will listen at all. Is there not such a thing as seduction to the truth? Karl Jaspers, toward the end of his life, expressed his fear that one day it may become inevitable to dress truth itself in propaganda, just so it will reach people's ears. And then there is Soren Kierkegaard, who, to be sure, should find us on guard, for he loved irony. In his late years, he wrote a small volume on the approach employed in my literary activity, in which he summed up this approach with, "Cajole them into the truth. First, so says Kierkegaard, you have to tell them something nice, aesthetic, to capture people's attention. Launch the boat, as it were. Then, when it is floating along, let it run aground, namely on the rock of truth. Better hungry, though, to get away from there immediately, they will try to kill you. Be this as it may, this much remains true. Wherever the main purpose of speech is flattery, there the word becomes corrupted, and necessarily so. And instead of genuine communication, there will exist something for which domination is too benign a term. More appropriately, we should speak of tyranny, of despotism. On one side, there will be a sham authority, unsupported by any intellectual superiority, and on the other, a state of dependency, which again is too benign a term. Bondage would be more correct. Yes, indeed, there are on the one side pseudo-authority, not legitimized by any form of superiority, and on the other, a state of mental bondage. Plato evidently knew what he was talking about when he declared the sophist's accomplished art of flattery to be the deceptive mirage of the political process, that is, the counterfeit usurpation of power, a power that belongs to the legitimate political authority alone. Of course, this cannot as yet be called use of force and exercise the power in a strict sense. It is not yet for real, as it were, but much less, at any rate, are we moving, perchance, within a neutral territory, separated from the political reality and labeled, say, the press, or the cultural domain, or the field of literature, or whatever name one chooses. Public discourse, the moment it becomes basically neutralized with regard to a strict standard of truth, stands by its nature ready to serve as an instrument in the hands of any ruler to pursue all kinds of power schemes. Public discourse itself, separated from the standard of truth, creates on its part, the more it prevails, and an atmosphere of epidemic proneness and vulnerability to the reign of the tyrant. Serving the tyranny, the corruption and abuse of language becomes better known as propaganda. Here, once again, though briefly, I have to mention Plato and the translation of Plato. More translations have the art of persuasion in this context. Plato himself, however, in the Politeia, the great dialogue on the social and political order, characterizes the essence of injustice as the combination and collaboration of pitho and bia, rendered as persuasive word and brute force. Obviously, something is lost when the translations speak only of cajoling, wheedling, and flattery. Left out is the element of menace. But then again, the most perfect propaganda achieves just this, that the menace is not apparent but well concealed. Still, it must remain visible. It must remain recognizable. At the same time, for those for whom the menace is intended must nevertheless be led and eased into believing, and that is the true art, that by acquiescing to the intimidation, they really do the reasonable thing, perhaps even what they would have wanted to do anyway. All this is not outside our own experience, yet propaganda in this sense by no means flows only from the official power structure of a dictatorship. It can be found wherever a powerful organization, an ideological clique, a special interest, or a pressure group uses the word as their weapon. And a threat, of course, can mean anything besides political persecution, especially all the forms and levels of defamation or public ridicule or reducing someone to a non-person, all of which are accomplished by means of the word, even the word not spoken. Karl Jaspers counted among the forms of modern sophistry, as he calls it, also the lingo of the revolution, which, intent on fomenting rebellion through agitation, singles out one isolated instance and focusing its spotlight on this makes everyone blind to all the rest. The common element in all of this is the degeneration of language into an instrument of rape. It does contain violence, albeit in latent form, and precisely this is one of the lessons recognized by Plato through his own experience with the sophists of his time, a lesson he sets before us as well. This lesson, in a nutshell, says the abuse of political power is fundamentally connected with the sophistic abuse of the word, indeed, finds in it the fertile soil in which to hide and grow and get ready, so much so that the latent potential of the totalitarian poison can be ascertained, as it were, by observing the symptom of the public abuse of language. The degradation, too, of man through man, alarmingly evident in the acts of physical violence committed by all tyrannies, concentration camps, torture, has its beginning, certainly much less alarmingly, at that most imperceptible moment when the word loses its dignity. The dignity of one word, to be sure, consists in this: through the word is accomplished what no other means can accomplish, namely communication based on reality. Once again, it becomes evident that both areas, as has to be expected, are connected. The relationship based on mere power, and thus the most miserable decay of human interaction, stands in direct proportion to the most devastating breakdown in orientation toward reality. I spoke of public discourse becoming detached from the notions of truth and reality. This brief characterization may still be too mild. It does not yet express the full measure of devastation breeding within the sophistic corruption of the word. It is entirely possible that the true and authentic reality is being drowned out by the countless superficial information bits noisily and breathlessly presented in propaganda fashion. Consequently, one may be entirely knowledgeable about the thousand details and nevertheless, because of ignorance regarding the core of the matter, remain without basic insight. This is a phenomenon in itself already quite astonishing and disturbing. Arnold Galen labeled it a fundamental ignorance created by technology and nourished by information. But I wanted to say something far more discouraging is readily conceivable as well. The place of authentic reality is taken over by a fictitious reality. My perception is indeed still directed toward an object, but now it is pseudo-reality, deceptively appearing as being real, so much so that it becomes almost imperceptible any more to discern the truth. Plato's literary activity extended over 50 years, and time and again he asked himself anew, what is it that makes the sophist so dangerous? Toward the end, he wrote one more dialogue, The Sophist, in which he added a new element to his answer. The sophists, he says, fabricate a fictitious reality. That the existential realm of man could be taken over by pseudo-realities whose fictitious nature threatens to become indiscernible is truly a depressing thought, and yet this Platonic nightmare, I hold, possesses an alarming contemporary relevance, for the general public is being reduced to a state where people not only are unable to find out about the truth, but also become unable even to search for the truth, because they are satisfied with the deception and trickery that have determined their convictions, satisfied with a fictitious reality created by design through the abuse of language. This, says Plato, is the worst thing that the sophists are capable of wreaking upon mankind by their corruption of the word. There is now the ancient saying, corruptio optimi, pessima. The best corrupted becomes the worst. Those who have some notion about the worst must also, according to this saying, have a notion about what is best. We have to say, of course, that Plato is not simply taking an anti-sophist stance. More decisively is the intensity of his prior positive affirmation. His unwavering, strong opposition can fully be comprehended only in view of his own position regarding the overriding importance of the good that is endangered and threatened by the sophists. With this, indeed, we touch on his most basic convictions relative to the value and meaning of human existence as such. This we cannot discuss here at any length. Still, I wish to sum up Plato's stance in 3 brief statements. The first statement: to perceive as much as possible all things as they really are, and to live and act according to this truth. Truth, indeed, not as something abstract and floating in thin air, but as unveiling of reality. In this consists the good of man. In this consists a meaningful human existence. The second statement: all men are nurtured first and foremost by the truth, not only those who search for knowledge, the scientists and the philosophers. Everybody who yearns to live as a true human being depends on this nourishment. Even society as such is sustained by the truth publicly proclaimed and upheld. The third statement: the natural habitat of truth is found in interpersonal communication. Truth lives in dialogue, in discussion, in conversation. It resides, therefore, in language, in the word. Consequently, the well-ordered human existence, including especially its social dimension, is essentially based on the well-ordered language employed. A well-ordered language here does not primarily mean its formal perfection, even though I tend to agree with Karl Kraus when he says that every correctly placed comma is decisive. No, a language is well ordered when its words express reality with as little distortion and as little omission as possible. These 3 statements may also be considered the foundation of that community of teachers and students established by Plato in the grove of Academos, the foundation, that is, of the Platonic Academy. But as soon as I use the term academy, I do not speak about Plato alone. The term implies an original model from which everything academic in the world, up to the present day, derives its name, whether properly so or not. Of course, our contemporary universities, our institutions of higher learning, differ substantially from the original academy of ancient Greece. Still, the term academic expresses something that remained unchanged throughout the centuries, something that can be identified quite accurately. It means that in the midst of society there is expressly reserved an area of truth, a sheltered space for the autonomous study of reality, where it is possible, without restrictions, to examine, investigate, discuss, and express what is true about anything. A space, then, explicitly protected against all potential special interests and invading influences, where hidden agendas have no place, be they collective or private, political, economic, or ideological. At this time in history, we have been made aware amply, and forcefully as well, what consequences ensue when a society does or does not provide such a refuge. Clearly, this is indeed a matter of freedom, not the whole of freedom, to be sure, yet an essential and indispensable dimension of freedom. Limitations and restrictions imposed from the outside are intolerable enough. It is even more depressing for the human spirit when it is made impossible to express and share, that is, to declare publicly what according to one's best knowledge and clear conscience is the truth about things. All this hardly needs any specific explanation at all. Such a space of freedom needs not only a guarantee from the outside, from the political power that thus imposes itself on life. Such a space of freedom also depends on the requirement that freedom be constituted and defended within its own domain. By defended, we mean here not against any threat from the outside, but against dangers arising disturbingly within the scholarly domain itself, dangers we have discussed above. In this precisely consists the irreplaceable achievement of all instructions of higher learning in view of the bonum commune, the common good. Academic must mean anti-sophistic if it is to mean anything at all. This implies also opposition to anything that could destroy or distort the nature of the word, its communication, and its unbiased openness to reality. In this respect, Brody, that's enough. In this respect, we are well able to pronounce the general principle, and at the same time to be very specific. Opposition is required, for instance, against every partisan simplification, every ideological agitation, every blind emotionality, against seduction, though through well-turned yet empty slogans, against autocratic terminology with no room for dialogue, against personal insult as an element of style, all the more despicable, the more sophisticated it is, against the language of evasion, appeasement, and false assurance, which Karl Jaspers considered a form of modern sophistry, and not least against the jargon of the Revolution, against categorical conformism and categorical nonconformism. Do we have to go on? Clearly, none of these challenges can easily be translated into the organized approach of practical action, as the threat is elusive, Plato's experience throughout his life. So also are the means to resist it, and yet all this is of eminent political importance. At stake here is the purpose of our institutions of higher learning. Indeed, they are entities not to themselves within the framework of society, but to help determine society's overall condition. Their task, then, is to live out a paradigmatic model of conditions that sustain and nourish the structure of the political commonwealth at large, namely the free interpersonal communication anchored in the truth of reality, the reality of the world around us, the reality of ourselves, and the reality of God as well. Stop there, and next time I will read the second part of the essay, Knowledge and Freedom. So, this essay is very much like a book report on Plato's writings, and after reading this, that's what brought me to reading Plato. And that's when I took the time to read The Republic and Symposium and the Phaedrus. All excellent pieces of philosophy. And what I took away from reading Plato and listening to the dialogue, and particularly sometimes I would read it out loud so I could hear the words and with the punctuation, very much like sitting around talking with a bunch of gay men. So this whole idea of platonic relationship, meaning that there's no sexual back and forth. There is innuendo all throughout Plato's text. It's an extremely sensual text, but it is definitely homosexual, right? And sophists included women, and in large part lesbian women. And there is friction between those two groups frequently in philosophy. And so there's more to this idea of anti-sophism in juxtaposition to academia than what is being discussed here. And I think part of that is, that limitation in Pieper's dialogue comes from backing of Catholic dogma. This was printed by the Ignatius Press. They would have never ever been able to publish anything discussing that. And it's similar in the realms of the Gospel of Thomas, the Gnostic Gospel of Thomas, because there is direct reference to the duality of the human spirit having both male and female aspect, right? And it's not talking about gender. It's talking about the balance of energies, of yin and yang, right? These ideas exist in Shakti, Shiva. These ideas exist within all modes of philosophy, right? The mirror image, right? Anyway, I hope you found that really interesting, and I look forward to reading the next part.